Life in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a stroll through a lavender field. Between poorly ventilated castles, streets that smelled of anything but roses, and a life expectancy that made turning 40 a cause for celebration, work wasn't just a way to earn a living. It was often a test of physical and mental endurance. There were respectable trades, of course, like blacksmiths or scribes, but there were also jobs that made people wrinkle their noses and give thanks they weren't in the often tattered shoes of those who did them. Today, we dive into the literal and figurative muck to explore the 10 most revolting jobs of the medieval era. Get ready to feel queasy, uncomfortable, and, hopefully, chuckle a bit while learning how humanity survived these nauseating tasks. Let's start with the dung collector, a job that required no resume but an almost supernatural tolerance for stench. In the Middle Ages, manure wasn't just an unpleasant byproduct of daily life, it was a valuable resource. Farmers and peasants used it as fertilizer, and in an economy where every scrap of land had to produce, dung was practically brown gold. The dung collector, known in some places as a gong farmer, had the unenviable task of gathering human and animal waste from latrines, cesspits, and streets. Yes, streets, because many medieval towns lacked sewage systems, and people simply tossed their waste out the window, sometimes with a warning shout if they were feeling courteous. These workers spent their days shoveling excrement, carting it in rickety wagons, and delivering it to fields or depots where it was sold to farmers. The smell was, to put it mildly, a constant companion. Despite the value of manure, dung collectors didn't exactly live in castles. They earned little, lived on the fringes of society, and, to top it off, often worked at night to spare the delicate noses of daytime citizens. Picture it, a lone figure, covered in grime, shoveling under moonlight while the village sleeps. Romantic? Not quite. If you thought the dung collector had a rough day, wait until you meet the tanner. Leather production was essential in the Middle Ages, for armor, shoes, belts, and even books. But turning a cow or sheep hide into usable leather was an olfactory descent into hell. Tanners started with fresh hides, often still caked with flesh and hair. The first step was soaking them in water to soften them, which already created a breeding ground for bacteria and putrid smells. Then came the fun part, soaking the hides in a mixture of urine and manure to loosen the hair for removal. Yes, urine. Tanners often asked neighbors to contribute their liquid donations to fill the vats. Once the hair was removed, the hides were soaked in oak bark or, in some cases, more manure to tan them. This all took place in open workshops, where the stench clung not just to the tanners' clothes but to their very soul. Tanners lived on the outskirts of towns, not because they were antisocial, but because no one wanted to live near their workplace. Though leather was valuable, tanners were seen as pariahs, smelling of death and serving as a constant reminder that medieval fashion came at a steep cost. Now, let's turn to a job that combined danger, disgust, and a touch of forgotten heroism: the sewer cleaner. Larger medieval cities like London or Paris had rudimentary sewer systems, which were more like open ditches filled with all sorts of waste, human, animal, food scraps, and whatever else people decided to toss. The sewer cleaner, often a child or a small man, because the tunnels were narrow, had to crawl into these ditches to clear blockages. Armed with little more than a stick and sheer willpower, they navigated dark, damp, and unspeakably filthy spaces. The risks weren't just olfactory. Sewers could collapse, fill with toxic gases, or, at best, leave the worker coated in a layer of grime no amount of water could wash away. The pay was abysmal, and life expectancy even worse. Yet without them, cities would have drowned in their own filth, making them unsung heroes of sorts, though nobody was inviting them to parties. Another job that didn't win popularity contests was the butcher. Today, butchers cut steaks in clean, refrigerated environments. But in the Middle Ages, the job was a bloody, visceral spectacle. Butchers worked in open-air markets, slaughtering animals on the spot, often in front of buyers and onlookers. Blood flowed onto the ground, mixing with mud and street waste, while offal piled up, attracting flies and rats. Butchers didn't just kill and cut, they also dealt with the byproducts: intestines, heads, hooves, and anything not sold as prime meat. Sometimes these scraps were sold to the poor or used for sausages, requiring the butcher to plunge their hands into places no one should explore. Hygiene was a constant issue. Tools were rarely cleaned, and infections were so common that a bad cut could cost a butcher a finger, or worse. Though meat was a luxury in the medieval diet, butchers weren't exactly respected. They were often accused of selling spoiled meat or mixing questionable scraps into their products. In short, it was a bloody, smelly job with a dubious reputation. If the butcher's job was dirty, the barber-surgeon took it to another level. In the Middle Ages, barbers didn't just cut hair and shave beards, they were the de facto surgeons. Need a tooth pulled?
Go to the barber. An amputation?
Also the barber.
A bloodletting to balance your rumors?
You guessed it, the barber. This trade combined hairdressing skills with a kind of improvised medicine that was often more dangerous than the ailment itself. Barber-surgeons worked without anesthesia, with rarely cleaned tools, and in conditions where infection was an understatement. Pulling a tooth could mean breaking a patient's jaw, and a successful amputation was one where the patient didn't bleed to death. They also handled abscesses, sores, and open wounds, putting them in constant contact with blood, pus, and all sorts of bodily fluids. The barbershop was a place where the smell of blood mingled with burnt hair, because yes, they sometimes used fire to cauterize. Though essential in an era without specialized doctors, barber-surgeons were seen as both saviors and amateur butchers. It wasn't uncommon for a client to leave with a decent haircut but an infection as a bonus. Another job that deserves a spot on this list is the dyer. Creating vibrant colored fabrics was an art in the Middle Ages, but it left workers smelling like a failed chemical experiment. Dyers used a variety of substances to color cloth, from plants and minerals to, you guessed it, urine. Human urine, rich in ammonia, was a common fixative for dyes, especially for colors like blue and red. Dyers spent their days soaking fabrics in vats of foul-smelling liquids, mixing ingredients like blood, manure, and primitive chemicals like alum. Their hands were permanently stained, and the smell of the dyes clung to their clothes and skin like a curse. Many of the chemicals were toxic, leading to health issues from skin rashes to lung damage. Though colorful fabrics were a status symbol, dyers were seen as dirty workers, relegated to the margins of society. Imagine trying to flirt at the local tavern when your clothes reek of stale urine and your hands look like a sickly rainbow. Now, let's talk about the leech collector, a job that sounds like it came straight out of a nightmare. Leeches were a cornerstone of medieval medicine, used for everything from fevers to headaches, under the belief that bloodletting balanced the body's humors. But someone had to collect those leeches, and that someone was the leech collector. This unfortunate soul spent their days wading through swamps, ponds, and stagnant rivers, letting leeches latch onto their legs before carefully gathering them to sell to physicians or apothecaries. Yes, the most common method was using their own legs as bait. The collector would emerge from the water covered in leeches, bleeding, and likely praying not to catch an infection from the murky waters they worked in. The risk of disease was high, and the pay, predictably, was low. But leeches were in such demand that someone had to do it. Next time you complain about a mosquito bite, spare a thought for the person who willingly let dozens of leeches suck their blood for a living. We can't overlook the latrine cleaner, a close cousin of the dung collector but with a more intimate focus. While dung collectors worked in open spaces, latrine cleaners specialized in emptying the cesspits of castles, monasteries, and wealthy homes. These latrines were essentially holes in the ground connected to deep pits where waste accumulated. The cleaner would descend with a rope, if lucky, and a shovel, working in a dark, cramped space with a smell that could knock out a horse. In some cases, the pits were so deep that the worker had to literally wade through the waste. Accidents were common. Suffocation from gases, falls, or infections were daily risks. Though castles relied on these workers to stay habitable, latrine cleaners were treated as untouchables. No one wanted to shake their hand, let alone invite them to dinner. Yet their work was crucial. A castle with a clogged latrine wasn't exactly the dream setting for a medieval court. Another job that didn't earn applause was the chimney sweep. In an era where chimneys were the main source of heat, soot and ash quickly built up, clogging flues and filling homes with smoke. The chimney sweep, often a small child due to their ability to fit into narrow flues, had to climb through dark, filthy chimneys armed with just a brush. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and utterly suffocating. Soot got into their lungs, eyes, and skin, causing everything from respiratory issues to blindness in extreme cases. Falls were common, and child sweeps often got stuck in poorly designed chimneys. The pay was meager, and many sweeps were orphans or children from poor families, exploited by masters who saw them as disposable tools. Though sweeps might seem like quaint figures in stories, the reality was a brutal job that left workers scarred for life, physically and emotionally. Last but not least, we have the executioner's assistant. The executioner had a grim job, but the assistant got the worst of it. While the executioner wielded the axe or noose, the assistant handled the dirty work, cleaning up remains after an execution, dragging bodies, and sometimes torturing prisoners to extract confessions. Public executions were a common spectacle in the Middle Ages, and someone had to deal with the blood, fluids, and waste left behind. In dungeons, the assistant also handled torture tools like red-hot pincers or the rack, putting them in constant contact with human suffering in its rawest form. This job wasn't just physically repulsive but psychologically devastating. Executioners' assistants were seen as pariahs, feared and despised, living isolated from society. Though their work was necessary for the medieval justice system, no one wanted to look them in the eye. These 10 jobs, dung collector, tanner, sewer cleaner, butcher, barber-surgeon, dyer, leech collector, latrine cleaner, chimney sweep, and executioner's assistant, remind us that the Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. Behind every functioning city, every piece of leather, or every smoking chimney were people doing jobs that would make us shudder today. But these trades, as revolting as they were essential to medieval society. Those who performed them endured inhumane conditions with a resilience that deserves, if not applause, at least respectful acknowledgement. Next time you complain about your job, think of the person spending their days with leeches on their legs or shoveling dung in the rain. Suddenly, that Zoom meeting doesn't sound so bad, does it?